I'm Daron Spielman, and this is the True East Podcast. There is a gap, a dangerous one, between how Americans perceive Israel and the country that actually exists on the ground. And the real danger is that this gap is being seeded and exploited by forces that want to see the U.S. Israel relationship severed. My guest today is Dr. James Lindsay. He's an author, a mathematician, and one of the most influential voices in American conservative politics. James is known for exposing critical race theory and the ideological machinery that is hollowing out American institutions. But this time, James did not analyze Israel from afar. He got on a plane, he walked the streets of Israel, and he came to see it for himself. What he found shocked him. As he put it, it seems as though both the left and the right in America have invented an Israel that does not exist. Today, we're going to talk about what he saw there, how it challenged the narratives he'd been exposed to, and what that means for the future of the U.S. Israel partnership. James, welcome to True East, and thank you for joining me.
Hey, thank you for having me.
You know, I have to tell you, James, I spent the day at the Knesset meeting with a series of Knesset members and ministers, and when I told them that I was going to have you on my podcast, they were thrilled. And I think that many of them, I know you're known around the world, but many of them had not heard of you before inside of Israel. And you're coming here, and I think the remarks that you made afterwards made a real impact on Israelis. And they were very, very excited. You're having James Lindsay. And so I think that your trip here wasn't only very, very important for Americans and for many other people, but it was important for Israelis themselves. So I wanted you to know that, and they'll be listening too. About half the listeners in this podcast come from within Israel, so they're part of the audience.
Well, it's fantastic to hear. Thank you for telling me that.
So James, I want to jump right in. You have a fascinating background. You've campaigned for Obama. You were on the left. You moved to the right, to the conservative Republican Party, and now you've raised the red flag about the woke right, which we're going to talk about. And I think very few people have such a breadth of experience. You've seen both sides. You've seen the narratives of Israel on both sides, the left narrative, the right narrative, and everything in between. I wanted to ask you on this trip of yours to Israel, where I was fortunate to see you in the city of David. What was the moment when you realized that something was off in the narratives you've seen and heard and the Israel that you experienced?
I think it actually started almost immediately. Walking the streets of Jerusalem from, not the first night we got there, but the first day that we spent, I don't know, maybe I'm just a little bit naive and silly, but I thought, there's this almost mystique to the country. It's this thing, it's a monolith, it's over there, it's got it's kind of this unified, cohesive whole, and then you just see everyday life, right? So it's almost like a spell breaking almost right away that there's a bunch of different people, they have a bunch of different views, they're going about day-to-day life, it's not, this object of Israel as a single thing that's, got whatever relationship, positive, negative, whatever happens to be with the United States or the rest of the world. So the everyday life aspect started to sink in even before I met you, which was on our first full day while we were over there. So I think, though, the real change in mentality, or the real awareness that this is absolutely insane, what Americans tend to think about the country, kind of sank in as we first went south and we saw the Gaza envelope, and then some of the kibbutzes that were attacked on October 7th, and then obviously we went to the Nova Festival site as well. And then we turn around immediately on the back of that and we go north to the Golan Heights, and then we see the Syrian border, and we see the Valley of Tears, and we go over to the Lebanese border, and we see, kind of, and hear the story of what happened there as far as the most recent war and how it kind of concluded. And I think it was the moment when a lot of it sort of fell apart in that kind of series of activities for the narrative that the right holds is when we were standing there looking into Lebanon and hearing, about the struggles and the fights there. and the attempt to have finished the war back in January, and having given that objective up, that military objective and security objective for Israel, was given up voluntarily by the Israeli forces to hand Trump a political win in the United States. So the narrative on the right is, of course, that Israel is leading America around on a leash, that every single congressperson has an Israeli handler and or an IPAC handler, which is not the same thing. And so Israel is leading America around and dictating how it's going to operate and act in the world. But in fact, Israel is very generously risking its own security in order to maintain a positive working relationship and strategic partnership with the United States and hand President Trump a strategic political win, not a military win, not a security win. In fact, it's a security loss, but it gave Trump a gigantic political win on his opening week of office. And I was like, okay, now I'm completely convinced that the narrative from the right is completely wrong. Of course, I also came to listen through those few days. One day was all about Israeli law. We went to the Knesset, got a tour, got to talk to some people, some members. Simha Rothman in particular we talked with. And then you get this idea, again, the United States has this, the right wing in the United States has this completely incorrect idea that Israel's this monolithic political object that's kind of, figureheaded in this character of Benjamin Netanyahu, who represents everything Israel is doing, has done, ever will do, whatever. And it's like, wait a minute, no, there are leftists here. There are complicated internal politics as well. And so it struck me, I see a lot of this propaganda from the far right, and that's, Israel did this, Israel did that, and it might be, maybe in the 90s or the early 2000s. And I'm like, who did that? Did Benjamin Netanyahu do that, or did Ehud Barak do that? It's not the same thing. This is like saying, that America did XYZ and not making any allowances for it being the Biden administration or the Trump administration. There are actually different people with different factions with different beliefs that do different things in the world, that have different visions for the region and the relationship between Israel and other countries, including the United States. So I was like, okay, this is the stuff that I'm seeing is just so low resolution that you're not even looking at a picture of a real country. And then the moment where it really struck me that the left's narrative about Israel is wrong. Well, I mean, that's kind of a continuous, unfolding thing. Again, day-to-day life, Israelis do not seem to have the first impulse to want to just go attack people or cause problems or start fights. They don't have any, as far as I could tell. I'm sure there are some openly prejudiced people there, but as anywhere, but there doesn't seem to be this, raging hostility toward Christians or Muslims like you hear right and left. And then, there's just this reality, this cold reality of we're surrounded by people, some of whom are terrorists. We're willing to work with people who are not, and we're not willing to work with people who are, and we're going to take care of our security for our people and ourselves, and so be it, right? And then we drive down after we did the northern borders. We drove down through Judea and Samaria, what Americans call the West Bank, and saw what was actually, the situation there. We didn't stop. We didn't spend time. We didn't talk to settlers and all of that. We just drove through, kind of got a history lesson and a current affairs lesson as we drove through. And it's like, it's very clear after seeing Gaza and then seeing stuff from Hezbollah up north and then seeing what's going on in the so-called West Bank, as you hear it referred to from the American left, that the narratives are just completely wrong. Israel's not the aggressor here. Israel is fighting a defensive fight. Their presence in the Middle East does not qualify them as a settler, colonialist, aggressor object that these, 75 years later, these poor Palestinian Authority people that are running terrorist operations just can't figure out how to live with. Israel's put forth a lot of effort, a lot of attempt, a lot of generosity, learning about, how the people in the kibbutzim in the Gaza envelope were so generously trying to work with Palestinians, or Gazans, only to find out that they were like mapping out how to better destroy them in the attack, and that people that they had let into their homes and worked with and given jobs to and collaborated with were there among the attackers, killing them. When the day came, there's absolutely no loyalty, nothing earned, and that misconception that people had. It's just okay. So both of these narratives, the left in the West has constructed a false Israel that I knew was a false Israel, but it's shocking to see how false it is. The right has also constructed a false Israel that's almost as equally shocking, although that one took being there to see it. And then there's a country that's got some real political challenges, some real political divisions, and a lot of real people living real life under really tricky circumstances. I had this blazer with me that I wore when I had to dress up a little bit, and it's a decked out in America. It's a custom jacket, and underneath the collar on the back it says "Home of the Brave." And I felt actually embarrassed wearing my America, like the American flags on the inside, "Home of the Brave" being part of our national anthem, and I felt embarrassed. I was like, man, Home of the Brave is where, we don't have terrorist attacks every day. We don't have to take security this seriously. It's a completely different mindset when you're dealing with reality in reality every day versus, this kind of fictional internet silliness, and having, read a blog or watched a video or seen some TikToks and constructed this imaginary country. So it was an unfolding process. That was a very long answer to your question, I guess, but there was a lot that actually happened to where I remember I was, and this is the last thing I'll say about it. I woke up one morning when we were at Sea of Galilee, I think it was the morning that we were coming back south. We had already gone to the northern borders, and we were coming back south through Judea and Samaria that day to come back to Jerusalem. And I was scrolling through my phone there in the hotel room in the morning, just kind of catching up on whatever was going on. And I just saw a lot of, whatever stupid anti-Israel propaganda coming from the right-wing sources. And I couldn't even recognize it. I didn't know what these people were talking about. They might as well have been talking about a completely fictional place. And I had this weird moment of disconnection. Like I don't even know I don't recognize what these people are talking about at all. And it struck me as like, the narrative also is, well, Israel's losing the PR war. And I had this striking thought, like, how in the world are they supposed to even engage in the PR war when the PR is BS? I couldn't figure it out.
You bring up something so I think you really just drove right to the core. And I actually have chills while you're saying this because I'm an IDF spokesman. And for 120 days from October 7th, I was speaking to the foreign press and watching at the beginning our words get out there when there was sympathy with the destruction by most, let's say mainstream anchors that lasted around 3 weeks. And then everything began to switch. And I think Israelis, we constantly live this outer body experience. The issue is it's almost like freezing us in headlights. I mean, it's so not us that it's so painful. Like when we hear the word genocide, it's not just a rational, we can step back and kind of answer this question. It's deeply, deeply upsetting because we know there's 9 million people here, or maybe 8.5 of the 9 million people here know that this is a lie. We collectively know it's a lie. And yet we almost feel like our hands tied. And to hear you say it so clearly, I'm curious if you can shed some light for me and for our listeners. Why are we perceived this way? Meaning, what is it in America? Is it because America would never put up with this? I mean, I know you mentioned that you saw the red signs in Judea and Samaria. I think you said that where on your podcast, which, by the way, the New Discourse podcast, if anyone has not signed up for it, you have to go listen to it. It is brilliant. And your Am Yisrael Chai piece was so deeply riveting. You saw and you commented that Israelis, there's a red sign that says, if we go into Arab villages, it's at the threat of death and it's illegal. But within Israel, Arabs are allowed to go anywhere. And I'm just trying to understand, like, if that's the reality that we live in, why is this taking hold, this notion?
It's ignorance. People just don't know. I didn't know. I mean, I'd heard some of these stories, but, I couldn't picture it. And we just don't know. So, that's kind of like the example you give of these, red signs in these villages that are controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Okay, so you hear this story, and this is, in some sense, actually, there's like an apartheid action going on there, right? And so it's very easy to, so the Palestinians are basically like, if Jews come in here, we're going to kill them, right? So that space has been set aside and designated by them and their actions as, an unwelcome space. Okay, so now you have this tiny nugget of truth that there's some kind of an apartheid situation that's happening in Israel. And then you can say, well, look, Israel operates according to these laws, and then the Palestinian Authority, which, would be what Americans call the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, have these different laws. There's absolutely no understanding of the history of this or why that's the case or how it's played out or what concessions Israel's made over the decades trying to make this work, only to be kind of taken advantage of and rebuffed over and over and over again. And there's absolute, like I said, it's like absolute ignorance and nobody seems to care. But what you can then say is, well, look, there are areas this is what I hear. There are areas on the map that are controlled by Israel, and then there are areas on the map that are controlled by this completely other thing, and they feel, the Palestinian Authority, and they feel as though, and that's always the word, they feel as though they are excluded from full participation in the land and that they claim for themselves and the politics of the region and all this. And then you go over there and you look at it and you're like, yeah, because they're acting like barbarians and taking advantage of the goodwill of the people around them who keep trying. I almost got kind of frustrated sometimes hearing some of the history. It's, just why do you keep falling for this? Why do you keep trying so hard? Then, of course, then you start to remember there are different factions. There's Netanyahu is one faction. Not everybody loves him. A lot of people like him. Then Ehud Barak is a big proponent of the two-state solution, as it's called, trying to make that work. And so, it's again, well, why did we tolerate, a trans activist with bare fake breasts running around on the White House lawn under Biden? It's like, because what are we going to do about it, right? That was the leader at the time in power. What are you going to do about it? Complain on the internet, make a news story, I guess, and that's you've limited access to power. So anyway, I think it's just flat ignorance. People here just don't know, and they're able to take these seeds of what's going on from afar and turn it into this huge story. And then, like, the history, believe it or not, it's complicated. It's hard to explain why these are the things that are happening, what has developed over the years, how this has been again and again and again a betrayal. It's difficult to explain it to people, and what I get is I'm not reading all that. It's like they can say Israel's running an apartheid state and killing all these Palestinians, and then you say, well, do you know why? And they're like, well, I don't have time for a 30-minute history lecture. I'm not interested in hearing it. So I don't know that it's willful ignorance. It's almost, because willful means like you don't know and you don't want to know. But this is more like they don't know and they don't want to take the time or effort. It's like lazy. It's like will-less ignorance. I don't know. I'm looking for a word. They're too lazy to try to get to the bottom of it and to hear it out. You get these other narratives. But I think it's also mostly propaganda. You have a field of ignorance and you have people telling what sound like emotionally compelling stories into that ignorance and taking advantage of it to get people to believe absolutely crazy stuff. But the advantage of propaganda is that it doesn't have to grapple with truth. It doesn't have to grapple with reality. It only has to tell quick, emotionally satisfying narratives, so that I'm not going to read all that history or I don't want to hear this lecture. Mentality doesn't apply. The propaganda can be delivered in 60 seconds. They can say something just, well, here's the war. They can say something true. Here's the war. In the war, this many kids, according to the UN or whatever, which is probably a lie as it is, but here's an official source. Here's an official source that says this many children died in Gaza. So Israel's killing children. And then you can say that in 30 seconds. You can get an emotional response. You can put some imagery that's emotionally engaging. And then you try to explain to people, as like John Spencer has done, the realities of urban warfare and the extreme amount of caution that Israel's taken, and the fact that the collateral damage in this war has been the smallest amount in any war, I think, ever. And they just they're not equipped to hear it. And I think that that's a huge part of the problem. And then, like I said, the other side of this disconnect is what you mentioned. The Israelis are almost like deer in headlights, because it's so unrecognizable, the things they're hearing about themselves. And I have this experience too. People say, I woke up this morning to a fairly prominent British podcaster saying, everybody needs to remember, James Lindsay hates right-wing goals. And I'm like, who are they talking about? I don't even know this guy.
Who's this James Lindsay? Who's James
Yeah,
Lindsay?
right. All year, I've woke up to a new James Lindsay every day on the internet. And I'm like, half of it I don't know how to respond to because I don't even know, like, the things they're saying take me a lot of time even to work backwards through it to figure out how they got to the wrong conclusion, to start untying the knot. And then when you untie the knot, people say, I don't want to read all that, or you're being defensive. And that's what, these are the same kind of things that Israelis face. Oh, you're just being defensive. Oh, you're just trying to protect your tribe. Why is it that you can protect your tribe of people and white people can't protect their tribe of people? And they have these quick, emotionally resonant answers to the realities, which are somewhat complicated, that take some explanation, and that they're actually not that interested in hearing. And frankly, the nitty-gritties of these things are not typically emotionally resonant unless you actually come and see. Like, for me, this is a strange little detail, but, coming out in the podcast, Am Israel Chai, I'm talking about how I went to Yad Vashem and I came out and I saw life, on the other side, out in the just everyday Jerusalem. And I'm like, oh, wow, the people of Israel live. I get it. Okay. And then I went down to the Nova site with General Solomon, and he tells his story. And then, like, I think it's funny, honestly. It's kind of cute how some of the most meaningful things ever happen in, like, parking lots, like next to like a Honda or something like that. It's like, you got the Nova site over here, and of course that's a very emotional site, but we're in the parking lot. Of course you can see it from the parking lot, but we're standing next to just some cars, and it's like General Solomon's about to leave, and, like, he's spoken to us. I know he speaks English, but he's spoken to us in Hebrew all day. So in the back of your head, it's like, oh, he doesn't really speak English. What do I say to this guy to say thank you and bye? And it's just like, I grab him by the hand, meet his, shining eyes, and it's just like, Am Israel Chai is the only thing I know to say at this point, because I feel like I have to say something in Hebrew, and I have like 6 things. Like, good night's probably not the right thing, and shalom is okay, but, like, I'm kind of short on Hebrew. So I know I could have said it in English, but for whatever reason, when there's that perception of a language barrier, because he spoke Hebrew all day with a translator all day, your brain does weird things. So anyway, you have this weird moment where we met each other's eyes and we're like, Am Israel Chai to each other. And then it's like, it really connects. But at that point, I had seen something I don't see in America, and I'd seen it a lot, which are plainclothes people who are obviously reservists in the IDF, but you have to, like, I had to figure that out, though. I had to decode that. I didn't know what was going on. There were just plainclothes people and soldiers both in uniform walking around with machine guns. I never see that, ever, in the United States. I never see that. And I'm like, holy crap, this is a place where the security forces are literally everywhere. They're literally walking around armed. And
the civilian militia is we're quasi always in service.
That's right. And it's real. It's real right now. Like, you have this sense that, like, again, it's a reality could show up at any minute, in the kind of the dark sense of the phrase. And here are people who live their lives equipped to deal with reality showing up in the darkest sense at any minute, because that is reality here. And that's a huge shift in like mindset about what this place is, what's actually going on here, and what kind of narratives you hear about it. What free Western-style democracy in the world requires people to walk around in the street with machine guns pretty much everywhere, just because reality dictates that if they don't, a lot of innocent people might die today. It's a very surreal thing to kind of take in. And so there's this giant disconnect that it's very hard to communicate to Americans about what everyday real life is over there. And then, like I said, the snappy retorts, especially in this case from the left, are right to their lips. Well, yeah, that's because they're starting a war. And from the right, you hear a little bit of the same stuff, but the settler-occupier narrative, it's just immediately to the lips. There's this explanation that isn't reality that gets shoved into it. So I feel like it's hard to grasp without going. This is why everybody says, if you go, you know. But if you don't go, I mean, I knew which side morally to take. side practically to take in these conflicts very easily. I didn't have a difficult time making a decision even before October 7th, but certainly after October 7th, what to think and what to do. But you don't connect with it, properly until you actually come over and experience and realize, like, the people walking around here with machine guns are because I could be in the next terrorist attack too.
And right after you left, by the way, there was a terrorist attack at the junction of Gush Etzion, the entrance to Jerusalem. This was about a week and a half ago. A man was killed, 3 people were injured, and the terrorist, and this is often the case, was eliminated by a combination of civilians and security personnel right there. And you drove that spot during your tour, and this is happening, incredibly frequently. Even General Solomon, just for our listeners and our viewers, General Solomon, who is this incredibly handsome Israeli man, just in awesome shape. And I know he took you down south. I was jealous of that visit. I wanted to join you. He actually fought beside his son against terrorists over the course of hours. And I think General Solomon at that point was not in military gear. I think he just picked up his gun from his house and fought. And his son was is in the army.
Yeah, that's right. A pistol. And for 10 hours. Yeah, the story is just shocking, and it blows my mind. This is one of the reasons I wanted to tell a little bit of it in my podcast about that, the I'm Israel High podcast. But of course, Billboard Chris, who was on our delegation with us, put the whole video up of General Solomon's story that he related there at the Nova site, and he had it on his X. But of course, the way the X works is if you don't have the link, you're never going to find it. I put the link on the stub to the podcast so people can go see what he actually said. But he tells this story, and how the American right, I wanted the American right to hear this. So many of them are religious. So many of them, give all the glory to God and all of this, and they see that as central to being on the right side of basically everything. And so he's telling his story about how, something's happening. He gets a call. He doesn't know what's happening. He grabs his son, who's, from what I understand, not in the military. They get pistols, no machine gun, pistols. And they, holster them, get in the car to drive to headquarters. And then they see what's happening as they're driving by the Nova site, and they stop. And he's like, something's happening here. We have to try to help people. And he's trying to get people, these people waking up from a night of partying, groggy out of it early in the morning. And he's like, no, this isn't like a small thing. You have to run. You have to run away. And he's getting people to run, and they won't. And I can't leave my car. I can't leave my stuff. And it's like, shut up and run. He's trying to get them to do it. And at some point, like, you have, I don't know exactly the detail of the story at this point. I'm not recollecting it correctly, but like, Hamas is coming, and he's like, I'm going to die. So he prays his prayer that you pray before you die. And he adds in at the end, like, let me save more of these people. Like, that's all he's thinking about, is how do I save these innocent, like, hippie music festival party people? Like, this is the kind of guy that, like, in America, the stereotype of like the big tough general guy is not going to be that invested in like hippies and party goers. But he's like, how do I save more people? He thinks he's going to die in this instant. And just immediately his prayer gets answered. A tank rolls up. Turns out the tank is not fully capacitated. It's already been badly attacked and damaged. There's only one surviving member in the tank, who is the driver. And it just starts kind of running over people. But General Solomon is able to escape, and it's running over cars, and it's like kind of doing what tanks can do without a gunner. And then he gets trapped again, and he prays again, believing he's about to die, says the same prayer, let me save more of these people. And then the tank like had wheeled around and like somehow gets the guys that were about to get him and saves his life again. And then the tank goes over and stops because the guy driving it died because of the damage that had happened within it from the earlier attack. And so he goes over, decides to set that up as a makeshift base, right? And he starts huddling these guys at the music festival behind it. And of all like small miracles, it turns out he was in a tank division when he was active duty. And so he knew how the equipment on a tank works, which means he knew how to make the machine gun come free, the external machine gun come free of the tank body. He knew how to work the machine gun, but it was jammed. So here comes Hamas. He's got people hiding behind the tank. He's trying to get people to hide behind the tank. He's got this gun. It doesn't work. Third time, he prays the same prayer. I don't know how much ammunition the gun has, but it turns out the gun starts to work after the prayer, and he has enough to be able to hold these, Hamas terrorists off. Militants, actually, way beyond terrorists at that point. I don't even know what the enemy army actually is able to hold them off for several hours and secure 70 or 80 more people whose lives he saves. And 300 and something people lost their life there, and he saved like 400 and something people by any reasonable estimate, 75 or so of whom are hiding behind the tank while he's laying there, 3 miracles deep. It's like, this is an incredible story. This is the kind of thing that you would think would grab the average American conservative by the deepest roots of their conscience and motivate them to realize kind of what's really going on there is not the story that, these wretched propagandists, whether they're, American homegrown, whether they're getting foreign narratives fed to them from, whether it's Palestinians, whether it's somebody else, like, you think it would just click. But again, it's people don't hear these stories. This story doesn't make it to the United States. This is why it was so important to Chris to put it up on his X account in full, the full video, with good audio of the translator. And it was important for me to relate that story in that podcast and to tell it again here, even though, this is limited time. This message has to be able to reach the conscience, I think, to break this spell, that this is actually what Israel represents. It's the same thing. You zigzag through Yad Vashem. From what I've heard, we were on a bit of a rush because the sun was setting. They're going to kick us out. Actually, they were going to lock us in, is what the tour guide said. And it was like, you don't want to be locked in here, I promise you. And it's like, so we're zigzagging through. But I heard after the fact that a lot of people can't finish. They go in there and they make it about halfway or so, and they can't finish. They have to just quit, take the shortcut out or whatever. And so we kind of go through quickly. So it was an abbreviated tour, so it wasn't as heavy as it could have been, but it was quite heavy, obviously. And we come out the back, and there's just real life. Like somebody had said at one point, Israel's revenge on the Nazis wasn't to go destroy Germany. It was to make a lot of babies and make a thriving country. And you see it with your own eyes. We were blessed that we came out in the dark, because you see headlights and taillights and shining city lights. And I think it was a much stronger effect than if we had come out in daylight and, you don't have the lights that make it so stark that there's vibrant life happening here. And I just, I don't know how you get that to connect to somebody, but of course, we have these rampant narratives that, the Holocaust didn't even happen. And what are you talking about? I just read, actually.
Who do you think's seeding these? I mean, you had mentioned this before, and I'm very curious. We see you and what you're saying, and it's touching so many hundreds of thousands of people and maybe millions of people. And then you have these Nick Fuentes, Tucker Carlson, and a whole slew of other people. And I did hear you mention that maybe what you're battling against and we're battling against is not just grassroots opposition. Is there something deeper here? Are these ideas being seeded and funded, do you think, by some other, maybe offshore type of people?
Yeah, I don't think this is a primarily grassroots operation in any regard whatsoever. I don't have any hard proof of anybody being funded or being captured by, compromat, to use a very specific Russian word on purpose. There are rumors of such things, of course. At this point, Tucker Carlson is being more or less called Tucker Carlson, to suggest that he's got some kind of business arrangement or financial arrangement with Qatar that's getting him to push these narratives. I know that I experienced personally when I stood up about not an Israeli or Jewish issue, but about the H-1B issue back at the end of the year last year, the H-1B visa issue, which primarily has to do with Indian immigrants to the United States, but others as well, but primarily Indian immigrants. I stood up into that. I actually said that, we should not engage with this, what I thought was an astroturfed argument being made within America about whether or not we accept high-skill legal immigrants or not. of course, most conservative Americans agree that we need to get the illegal immigrants out of America, especially prioritizing the criminal elements, the unknown elements. But then all of a sudden we're having this huge argument about legal immigrants. And so I step into this and I'm like, wait a minute. Why are we doing this? Don't engage in this. This is definitely an operation to get us fighting about something that we weren't fighting about 2 weeks ago. And immediately I got attacked like I've almost never, maybe 2 or 3 other times I've been attacked at the scale that I got attacked online. It was even with a lot of experience being attacked online. It was very disorienting. And so it turns out later I have some, expert investigators that end up talking to me and looking into this for me. And they're like, do you realize that over 40% of the accounts that were attacking you were Russian? And what they were nearly all seeding into the discussion were blatant neo-Nazi talking points. So I have every reason to believe, after my own even personal experience butting up against some of these so-called debates that I think are actually psychological and political warfare operations against our country and our conservative movement over here, every reason to believe that they're being seeded at least by Russia, because that's who the data showed attacked me in overwhelmingly disproportionate numbers. And the types of things that they were pushing were blatant. I mean, not things that the crazy left would say, oh, that's kind of Nazi. I mean, glorification type videos of SS officers. I mean, outright
Wow.
Nazi stuff, like real Nazi propaganda. Hitler with the glowing eyes motif to make him look like he's cool and part of the trend, literally heavy duty. And then to find out that 40-something% of it is Russian in origin. Of course, we're starting to see a lot of weird ties now that have come out in the last couple of weeks, actually, just very, very recently, that are starting to make, a lot of suspicion be that some of these things are being funded or seeded or planted or led around by Russian operations through social media and maybe other, more direct sources. And that's just one country. When I was in Israel and I talked to different people, I just kept hearing the same 5-letter country mentioned, Qatar, 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 over and over and over again. And we know they're dumping not some money, rivers of money. We know that they were dumping rivers of money into the American left.
I've heard up to 350 billion at this point, and there is a
Yes.
very, very. There's a study that's taking place. I won't say by who. It will be released in the next year, and with all the numbers tracking everything, we're talking hundreds of billions.
Hundreds of billions of dollars, which is a lot more than the $7,000 that Israel allegedly paid me. Which, P.S., the check hasn't showed up yet.
And you got underpaid.
Yeah, it's not here yet. Let's get it together, guys. This is 7K. Let's make it happen. So at any rate, this is almost definitely. And then you got China, of course, has every interest in backing all of this too. China has huge interests in severing the relationship between the United States and Israel so that they have kind of unfettered access to do what they will with their Belt and Road stuff, just dealing directly with the Arab nations and to get America out of the question.
I want you to unpack this a bit because China is, the big global actor. They've already, dwarfed, I think, Russia in terms of, where they're front and center, even with President Trump. Why is little Israel and the relationship, a country of 10 million people, its relationship with America of 350 million people, why is this important to China? Can you unpack this for us?
Yeah, I mean, as far as I only know so much, just to qualify, I'm not a geopolitical and international security expert, but it's not hard to guess and to know a little bit that the Belt and Road Initiative obviously has to run through the region. In fact, there are 2 maritime routes and 1 land route. The land route is supposed to have a kind of like a hub in Iran in order to then the next hub up that land route is supposed, what is it, the new Silk Road they call it, is supposed to run up to Budapest. But I think Tehran is the hub before that. And so it's, this whole region in the, directions, Eastern Mediterranean is filled with shipping lanes, both land and sea, that are incredibly important to China's economic ambitions, whether those are across Europe, whether they're across Asia, whether they're down into Africa. And then when you start talking about maritime shipping routes, you're now talking about the entire globe. And so you have the possibility. So China's ambition with the Belt and Road Initiative is to create an economic superhighway, or I guess 3-lane superhighway, that has direct access to the market of 5.9 billion people, which is an enormous economic reservoir. And so if you have a Western-style democracy stuck right in the middle of all that, gathering crazy intelligence on what's going on, that has strongly vested interests in not letting the other regional powers run the board however they want, and then it's, in strategic partnership with the global military and economic superpower, you have a major problem for your plans. It's not that Israel operates in any way whatsoever as an American outpost, but it's that we have almost identical security and economic concerns about the other players on the board, and we have very similar underlying values. So Israel happens to be located in an absolutely crucial spot for massive global trade and represents a massive disruption to the ability to do that in an unfettered way by the BRICS alliance or by China itself with its partnerships with the Arab states. And then to make it worse, it's in strategic partnership with the global superpower that would probably, and I think the world would be better off if it were to able to maintain its status as the world's economic and military superpower. America has not been a perfect steward of its power by any means, but it has been a damn good one by comparison to what you could imagine a country like China or Russia would do with the same kind of power and access.
Do you think, I'm listening to you, James, that, talking about balancing Israel and America, where America is now, can you maybe this is an overly simplistic question, but, Israelis want to believe that we are important to America, besides the strategic level, that we're sitting here in the Middle East, that there's more to us than Qatar, and more to us than Saudi, more to us than, let's say, Saudi Arabia is to the U.S. And in fact, when President Trump last week, I think that the moment that every Israeli was like, oh no, was when he said, well, Saudi Arabia is a great ally and Israel's a great ally. Like we felt, wait, hold on. There's something special about this relationship with the U.S. Is it a country like the U.S. is 350 million people? Is there, beyond the strategic location of Israel, is Israel important to the U.S.?
I mean, I think it has been, particularly for the largest single kind of political voting cultural bloc in the country, which has been, up to this point, has been evangelical Christians, who are not a majority of the country on their own, but they are a very significant, a very, very significant plurality. And so they're a very powerful bloc in terms of, like I said, voting, electoral issues, political issues, but also just cultural. They're like the cultural counterweight to everything else happening, and they tend to be very serious about their faith. They tend to be very kind of therefore difficult to sway with the cultural fads of the era, and so there is a deep kinship there. In fact, I had a meeting with a important, I shouldn't name anybody, but an important evangelical person in the United States. I don't want to call him an evangelical leader. He does something a little bit different, but he is a leader. So I meet with this guy, and we're talking probably an hour about Israel. We end up talking about it. And, he's very, very clearly lays it out for me. There's kind of 3 dimensions, at least, to this discussion, which there's the practical argument, which I just got into a little bit on kind of, the geopolitical side of things. And then there's a moral argument, which is just, in fact, rooted on the fact that the values that we see between our two countries are in so many ways so similar, and that we represent so many of the same moral underpinnings, and therefore have the ability to bring that into our respective regions and the world and to safeguard those types of values, to be like a beacon or a lighthouse for those kinds of values. You don't have to be evangelistic, it turns out, to say, like, look, here's what we're doing, and it works. It works better than what other people are doing. And there's something special about what we're doing, and we would love for other people to, not try to blow us up for it. And then there's a theological argument that, of course, I don't tend to make as much, but he was very clear because he's an evangelical pastor. And he's very clear that there's a deep theological connection also between Israel and the United States, which I perceive doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. I mean, somebody could have made the argument, I think, maybe a couple of decades ago, that a similar kind of kinship exists between the British and the United States. We have, of course, also sort of a direct historical and even ethnic heritage there as well that creates another special relationship. But the theological underpinnings of the United States are, everybody wants to say these days, this is a Christian nation, and to a degree, culturally it is. But I had, and not to rely too heavily on AI, LLMs as a source, but I don't know how to do this analysis myself. So I asked Grok to lay it out and to give me sources that I could go follow up with, and the sources seemed to corroborate what it said. It didn't seem to make this up. It said, what are the legal foundations of the United States as it was constituted in the late 18th century? Is like, how would you break down the sources of those between, the Hebrew Bible, the Christian religion, the Greek tradition, the Roman tradition, which are the ones that we mostly hear about? And it immediately spit back out 75% Hebrew Bible. So the U.S. legal circumstance, they can argue all that they want, is a Christian construction, but is a Christian construction that directly recognizes Leviticus and Deuteronomy as kind of like the cornerstones upon which the whole project was built on the legal level. Of course, there are some Enlightenment, tweaks to the way we approach it. Of course, that brings in Greek ideas about the polis and the city-state and the idea of the republic. Of course, that brings in the Roman idea of rule of law, even though that was kind of not what we consider rule of law, blah, blah, blah. But 75% that our fundamental constitutional legal structure was rooted by citation, it said, on the Hebrew Bible. That's a profound theological connection, a covenant, like the idea of a covenantal nation to something that transcends ethnicity or a specific tribe of people or something like that. That's profound. Then it said that the cultural underpinnings were 75% Christian, but in the sense of being also Protestant, which tended, unlike Roman Catholicism at the time, tended to openly and flatly recognize that the Bible has to be read as one continuous document. If you're a Christian, it doesn't matter. Israel is still Israel, and Israel is still, in perpetual, eternal covenant with the same God that the Christians at the time would have believed in. And so you still have this deep theological connection. So there's a profound theological dimension to where we have a special relationship. And I actually felt that, talking with a lot of, observant to Orthodox Jews while I was there about theological matters. Of course, they're not going on about the Gospel of Matthew so much, but they are talking about things that are very resonant, whether it's Genesis, whether it's, Leviticus or Exodus, to the American consciousness, to Kings, Samuel, and so on, all of these different books of the different parts of what we call the Old Testament. And it's just so clear that this is the same deep cultural root, that we have two different trees growing, or two different branches growing out of this same root. So there's a very deep special relationship. So I think all three of those levels, I talked about the practical level, but there's a moral level that I elided because I think it's so obvious that it's hard to talk about. And that's 80% of the problem, because it's not obvious to everybody, but I feel like it should be. And it's hard to break into how you talk about it. And I have tried to bridge that gap a little bit with the podcasts and these interviews. And then you have, like I said, this theological dimension that I'm not particularly equipped to talk about on a deep level, but I think is an incredibly important level to talk about. And this, I do want to develop the argument soon that this particular theological debate applies to these kind of Western continental philosophies that swept through Europe, both far left and far right, and that's a fundamental break and a fundamental, complete rejection of the theological underpinning that defines both Israel and the United States, uniquely among nations. Britain, I think, was kind of doing an okay job of things until a couple of decades ago, honestly, in the same regard. But they've really fallen off the horse in the last few decades. But at any rate, there are deep, deep, deep levels. It's not a simple matter. It's actually a very profound question as to why there is such a special relationship. And I think that this attack that we're seeing, whether it's primarily foreign seeded, whether it's, our own deep state or deep states coordinating to fill the airwaves with garbage to confuse people, I think a lot of it has to do with breaking apart that special relationship that even if we weren't in a kind of alliance or strategic military arrangement or any of this or intelligence sharing arrangement, it would still provide this kind of very deep core morally and theologically between our nations that cannot be denied. And in fact, I think to get under the practical argument, we're going to have to move into talking more about those connections while those are trying to be severed by a lot of, in my opinion, very bad actors.
You've I've often spoken. I wrote in my book, When the Stones Speak, I talked about the indigenous biblical nature of Israel. And I think you're so right that, I had John Spencer on the podcast and he's brilliant. And again, for anyone who wants to listen and learn, right, John Spencer will explain exactly what we're doing. However, when you have a John Spencer talking so well and the other side, all they say is, you stole our land, you stole our land, you stole our land, that it undercuts it in its absolute simplicity. And it falsely goes to, let's say, a core argument, which means anything that John Spencer or Durham Swindle, anything we say doesn't matter because it's a core argument. The of course, false argument that we stole their land, that we're colonialists. I think what you're saying and what you're bringing up on this moral and religious level is our core argument. It is our core relationship. It is something that goes deeper than exactly how we aim towards the house, trying to kill the terrorists without killing the civilians. We didn't know we were there because we're not tracking them. And if this is what our enemies are trying to sever, in many cases, if we want to know what to push, it's actually what our enemies are trying to sever. And I think that not only for you to do this, but I take this back to Israel, our spokesmanship, our communication, and we are up against, a world that is a media that is largely, anti-Israel. We have got to go back to exactly what you just said. These core arguments that we are indigenous to the land, that our relationship with the United States is a deeply spiritual and religious calling that is based on biblical ethics. And, I'm curious, discussing this, I only saw you for a minute in the City of David. What did that resonate with you in this part of the story?
Yeah, of course. And what you just said strongly resonated with me. By maybe there are no coincidences, but by a coincidence. So the idea that you're going to go out of your way to kill the terrorist and not the civilian, et cetera. This is obviously a value that America shares in how it conducts warfare, how on an ethical level it engages the world, even kind of in its worst moments and worst situations. War being kind of that example. All right, so the enemies that you're fighting do not think this way. They are eager to be martyred in many cases when they're full-blown Islamists and they've taken on this entire, ideology of kind of brutal jihad. They will put their military installation under a school or under a hospital and eagerly wait for it to be attacked so that they can come out and cry victim and tally up the number of innocent people who you tried to get out of the way, who were nonetheless killed. And, even to my opinion, even a child screaming something like, death to Israel, death to Jews, death to America, is 7 years old, is still an innocent that, they're 7, they're brainwashed and they're kind of a double victim here. And so this kind of value is profound. But last night, I'm reading this difference starkly. Somebody suggested to me, in fact, an Israeli that I met just kind of randomly. I was flying home from another trip that I went on for work, and he sends me a message and he says, "Have you ever read the speech that Heinrich Himmler gave at Posen in 1943, I think, 43, October 43. And I said, no, I haven't read this. And so it turns out I have a copy of, I have a book that has a copy of this speech in it, and I have the digital copy, and so I had it with me. And so I said to myself, I wonder if it's in that book. And I opened up the book, and there it is. So last night, I'm flying home, and I'm reading this speech that Himmler gave in 43. So at this point, I asked the Grok again. I said, how many Jews had been killed in the Holocaust by the time he gives this speech? And it says 4 to 4.5 million. And I say, okay, like, what was I know who Himmler was, but what was his role in this, right? In the Holocaust? And and it says that he didn't directly kill anybody, but he directly organized and oversaw every single one of the deaths, both from the Einsatzgruppen with the so-called Holocaust of bullets to the gas chambers to the everything. And I'm thinking, okay, that's who this guy is. And so I read it, and it was very clear. Like, a lot of it's kind of, technical speech or whatever, and wasn't that interesting. But the first part was very interesting. And he's talking about what it means to be an SS man. And he's talking about about the attack on Russia in particular. And he says, okay, so, you guys say that we're monsters because we get women and children to dig an anti-tank ditch. And, 10,000 of them will die digging this ditch, women and children. And he says, well, what do I care? I don't care about, I'm a German. Germans don't care about Russians. Germans don't care about women and children of the enemy who are going to bring lower racial people into the world that might contaminate our people, that might contaminate German blood. We don't care about the Czech. We don't care about the Russian. We don't care how many of them die. As a matter of fact, the more that die, the better, because they won't bring more people into the world of inferior quality that might contaminate Germans. But what we do care about, the only depth that we care about that, is whether or not they finish digging the trench, because if they fail to finish digging that trench against the tanks, that might cause more German blood to be spilled, and not a drop of German blood should be lost. And I'm like, these people are, it's easy to say these people are monsters, but this is a fundamentally, morally oppositional view to the way Israel and the United States and, again, Britain, truly civilized countries engage in the idea of warfare. It's not all about power. It's not all about victory at any cost. It's not all about ourselves. There is a bigger picture that is taken into account, even in warfare, even in the ugliest thing that human beings end up finding themselves involved in. And the fact is that creates a profound kinship between us that is unlike what most of the world would recognize. And a lot of people, even in our own country, start to fall into this. They get afraid, they get angry, whatever it is, and they just want kill them all. Kill them all. Who cares? Let God sort them out or whatever. But that's not as bad as what Himmler was saying, but it's a couple of steps down the same road that ends at Himmler, or that ends at this radical jihadi who's willing to put a 7-year-old child in front of his body in order to have the opportunity to shoot at more, not just IDF soldiers, but innocent Israelis if he gets the chance. This is a fundamental question of life-loving versus death-loving approaches to humanity, how we engage in the world around us. And this kinship exists only between a few countries, Israel and the United States being, I think, a very strong example. Britain historically, to a degree, I kind of like back in the 1800s how the French called their colonial mission the civilizing mission. They were going and civilizing other parts of the world. That's what we're not supposed to like that. But the idea that we're bringing the fundamentals of civilization versus barbarism around the world, or that we're shining beacons of this, or that we're doing what we can as security states to safeguard this very rare mentality that separates us from the absolute worst things human beings can end up doing to each other, I think is profound and at the center of why we have such a interesting and deep kinship. I think it's part of something that Trump sees in Israel that a lot of other politicians don't fully resonate with, and why he's been so pro-Israel. Like, Trump obviously hates war. He obviously loves life. He obviously loves, living life as well. And it's just resonant. He picks it up, I think, from what he sees with the way Israelis engage in the world. And I think that this is an incredibly important message for us to all kind of contemplate. You've got Himmler saying that, this, you can just picture, a blonde-haired Russian woman, maybe, or black-haired, it doesn't matter, digging a trench for his anti-tank mission. And he literally calls, because of her blood being insufficiently German, we're not even talking about somebody who's Jewish, for example. He literally calls them human animals. Human animals is the word he uses for a Russian, who he says he literally says the only reason we care about them whatsoever is in the capacity that they can be our slaves. He straight says that in this speech. And it's a thin line in the human heart between, as we see, when people get scared, when they get desperate, when they're terrified, when they're angry. There's a thin line in every human heart between how do we engage in the ugliest aspects of human existence while preserving and celebrating and cherishing life, and falling into this mentality of death and hatred. And I think that this, when we talk about the moral level and the theological level, these are the things that we share in common, that it's very easy to see examples of places that have lost that or maybe never had it. And the Nazi movement's obviously one such example. And the things that Israelis are forced to deal with on a day-to-day basis is another example. And the contrast is stark. You come away from visiting Israel as an American who understands kind of the moral picture with thinking it would be pretty good if Israel controlled most of the region. But I don't know how you get to that point without having to wage intentional positive war, which of course we don't do as a people on purpose. But you can tell it's like, Western style democracy with deep convictions toward life and values versus whatever's going on over there. It's a different story. And I wish more Americans could connect to it. I certainly wish more Americans would connect to that.
James, as we wrap up here, I want to tell you, when I listen both now to you speak, and also in your podcast, this concept of the life-affirming people that you talked about now, and that is a shared value between the U.S. and Israel. It's funny, for many Israelis, we're not even conscious of it. Every year they come up with this Gallup poll of the happiest countries in the world, and Israelis hear that, like, in 2024, right? So we're in the middle of the war. After 2023, we were like number 6 or 7 in the world, which is remarkable. And we went up to like number 2 of, like, the people that are happiest with their country and feel like the most positive value to their life. And it's almost like something that we don't understand, but listening to you speak, this life-affirming, almost we're unconscious life-affirming attitude that we have here, maybe that is really the key between us and the United States. And I think that while it seems overwhelming, this trend in the world to try to sever this tie, I didn't know this coming into the podcast, but I think that you nailed it. What we really have to do, we have to some degree rise above the rhetoric and hit these more, they're not more complicated, they're almost elevated concepts of moral affinity to each other, this life-affirming affinity that we have with each other, and a sense of, like, the divine in our everyday life. And I think you're an amazing representative. And I want to thank you on behalf of, truly, the people of Israel, if I may be so bold, for coming here, James. And it just shows the incredible impact, and you're a great patriot for the American people. And thank you for shedding light on the role that we play and the role that you can play for us. So thank you for joining me, James. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I look forward to coming back, and I look forward to continuing to carry the torch that I was able to pick up while I was there.
Thanks, James, for everything.